The horse is wearing a purple toga and a jeweled collar worth more than most senators' annual income. And you're standing in the Roman Senate watching in stunned silence as Emperor Caligula seriously proposes making his beloved stallion Incitatus a consul of the Roman Empire. Around you, the most powerful men in the known world, generals who've conquered nations, orators whose words have swayed millions, administrators who manage an empire spanning 3 continents are nodding gravely as if this is a perfectly reasonable political appointment. This is your life now. This is what the Roman Empire has become under Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known to history as Caligula, the man who will transform the greatest civilization the world has ever known into his personal playground of madness, cruelty, and depravity so extreme that even 2,000 years later, his name remains synonymous with absolute power, corrupted beyond all recognition. You are a senator in the year 39 CE, and you're watching the slow-motion destruction of everything Rome once stood for, one insane imperial decree at a time. But to understand how you got here, how the grandson of the beloved General Germanicus became a monster who makes Nero look reasonable by comparison, we need to go back to the beginning, to a time when Romans actually had hope for their young emperor. Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into one of history's most disturbing case studies in absolute power and its consequences, the brief, terrible reign of Emperor Caligula, whose 4 years on the throne managed to nearly destroy an empire that had taken centuries to build. From his promising beginnings as Rome's beloved prince to his assassination by his own guards, Caligula's story is a masterclass in how unlimited authority can transform a human being into something that barely qualifies as human anymore. So before we begin this journey into the darkest corners of imperial madness, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy exploring history's most fascinating and horrifying characters. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. There's something both fascinating and terrifying about sharing stories of people who held the power of life and death over millions, reminding us why absolute power remains one of humanity's most dangerous experiments. Now settle in, maybe dim the lights, perhaps be grateful you live in an age with constitutional limits on government power, and let's ease into tonight's exploration of what happens when an empire gives unlimited authority to someone who probably should have been kept far away from sharp objects, let alone supreme command. Your story begins not with Caligula's birth, but with the death of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, whose passing in 14 CE sets in motion the chain of events that will eventually place a madman on the throne of the civilized world. Augustus had transformed Rome from a republic torn apart by civil war into an empire that stretched from Britain to Syria, and his death creates a succession crisis that will haunt the imperial system for generations. The man who inherits the purple is Tiberius, Augustus's stepson, a competent but increasingly paranoid ruler who spends the last decade of his reign in self-imposed exile on the island of Capri, governing through letters and executing anyone he suspects of disloyalty. Tiberius is efficient but unloved, respected but feared, and when he dies in 37 CE, the Roman people are desperate for someone who represents hope, youth, and a return to the glory days of Augustus. Enter Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known since childhood by the nickname Caligula, Little Boots, earned during his early years when he accompanied his father Germanicus on military campaigns and charmed the legions by wearing a miniature soldier's uniform complete with tiny military boots. Caligula seems like the answer to Rome's prayers. He's 24 years old, handsome, charming, and blessed with the most prestigious bloodline in the empire. His father Germanicus was Rome's most beloved general, a man whose death under suspicious circumstances in 19 CE had caused empire-wide mourning. His mother Agrippina the Elder was Augustus's granddaughter, connecting him directly to the divine founder of the imperial system. More importantly, Caligula represents a clean break from the paranoid, reclusive style of Tiberius. Where Tiberius had been secretive and suspicious, Caligula promises transparency and generosity. Where Tiberius had avoided public appearances, Caligula embraces them. Where Tiberius had hoarded the imperial treasury, Caligula promises to spend freely on games, festivals, and public works that will restore Roman pride and prosperity. The early months of his reign seem to justify this optimism. Caligula releases political prisoners imprisoned by Tiberius, recalls exiles, and distributes generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, the urban populace, and the legions. He stages elaborate gladiatorial games and theatrical performances that remind Romans of their empire's wealth and power. He completes public works projects that Tiberius had abandoned and begins new construction that promises to enhance Rome's magnificence. Most importantly, he presents himself as a people's emperor, accessible and generous where his predecessor had been remote and stingy. He appears regularly in public, speaks directly to crowds gathered in the forum, and cultivates an image of youthful energy and imperial benevolence that makes Romans feel optimistic about their future for the first time in decades. But even during this honeymoon period, there are signs that something isn't quite right with the new emperor. Caligula's generosity isn't just lavish, it's reckless, as if he believes the imperial treasury is an infinite resource that can fund any extravagance he can imagine. His public appearances aren't just frequent, they're compulsive, as if he needs constant validation from crowds who cheer his every appearance. More disturbing are the rumors that begin circulating among the palace staff and the emperor's inner circle. Stories about Caligula's relationship with his sisters that go beyond normal family affection. Reports of violent temper tantrums when he doesn't get his way immediately. Accounts of decisions made on impulse without consulting advisors or considering consequences. These warning signs might have remained manageable if Caligula had surrounded himself with experienced counselors capable of providing guidance and restraint. Unfortunately, the combination of absolute power and unlimited wealth proves too intoxicating for a young man who's never been denied anything he wanted, and who's never faced serious consequences for his actions. The transformation begins gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a slow poison working its way through the imperial system. At first, it's just small departures from normal behavior that can be excused as youthful enthusiasm or imperial privilege. Caligula starts staying up all night and sleeping until afternoon. He begins making decisions without consulting the Senate or his advisors. He develops expensive tastes in clothing, food, and entertainment that push the boundaries of what even emperors typically indulge in. But these minor eccentricities are just the beginning. As months pass and no one successfully challenges his authority, Caligula's behavior becomes more extreme, more impulsive, more divorced from anything resembling rational judgment. The first major indication that something is seriously wrong comes in October of 37 CE, less than a year into his reign, when Caligula falls seriously ill with what court physicians describe as a fever that lasts for several weeks and leaves him dramatically changed. Whether the illness is physical or psychological, or whether it simply provides an excuse for behavior that was always latent, the Caligula who recovers is fundamentally different from the promising young emperor who had captured Roman hearts just months earlier. The change is immediately apparent to anyone who interacts with him. Where he had once been charming and accessible, he becomes unpredictable and dangerous. Where he had once consulted advisors, he begins making arbitrary decisions based on whims that change from hour to hour. Where he had once shown appropriate respect for Roman traditions and institutions, he starts treating them as obstacles to his personal gratification. Most alarmingly, he begins exhibiting signs of genuine delusion, claiming divine status and demanding worship from subjects who are expected to treat him not as a human ruler, but as a living god whose every desire is sacred command. This isn't just megalomania, it's a complete break with reality that transforms the imperial court into a theater of the absurd, where senators, generals, and administrators must pretend that insanity is wisdom and madness is policy. Your daily life as a senator during this period becomes an exercise in survival psychology. You wake up each morning not knowing whether the emperor will summon you for a reasonable policy discussion or order your execution because he doesn't like the color of your toga. You attend Senate meetings where serious business is interrupted by imperial decrees that defy logic, such as the famous occasion when Caligula declares war on Neptune, the god of the sea, and orders the legions to march to the beach and collect seashells as spoils of war. The horse consul proposal isn't an isolated incident of imperial eccentricity, It's part of a systematic campaign to humiliate the Senate and demonstrate that traditional Roman institutions exist only at the emperor's pleasure. Caligula doesn't just want to govern Rome, he wants to remake it according to his personal fantasies, regardless of the cost in dignity, resources, or human lives, and the costs are mounting rapidly. The generous spending that characterized Caligula's early reign quickly depletes the massive treasury surplus left by the frugal Tiberius. Within 18 months of taking power, Caligula has spent an estimated 2.7 billion sesterces, roughly equivalent to several $billion in modern currency, on games, building projects, bonuses, and personal luxuries that serve no purpose beyond his immediate gratification. When the money runs out, he doesn't reduce spending or implement more modest policies. Instead, he begins finding creative ways to extract wealth from his subjects through methods that combine legalized theft with sadistic entertainment. Caligula revives the practice of charging prominent Romans with treason, confiscating their property, and either executing them or forcing them into exile after they've been stripped of everything they own. But unlike previous emperors who at least maintained the pretense that these prosecutions were based on actual evidence of disloyalty, Caligula makes it clear that the accusations are arbitrary, and the real crime is possessing wealth that he wants for himself. He begins auctioning off gladiators at prices that force wealthy Romans to bid against each other for fighters they don't want, with the understanding that anyone who refuses to participate will be charged with insulting the emperor's dignity. He institutes new taxes on lawsuits, marriages, and prostitution, then retroactively demands payment for years when these taxes didn't exist. Most creatively, he positions himself on the bridge connecting his palace to the Temple of Jupiter and charges admission for citizens who want to cross, claiming that people should pay for the privilege of walking in the shadow of a living god. These fundraising schemes would be merely corrupt if they were implemented by a rational ruler seeking to finance legitimate government expenses. But Caligula uses the money he extorts from his subjects to fund projects that exist only in his imagination and serve no purpose beyond demonstrating his unlimited power. He builds a temporary floating bridge across the Bay of Naples, a distance of about 3 miles, just so he can ride his horse across it wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, which he's had stolen from Alexander's tomb in Alexandria. The project costs enormous amounts of money and serves no strategic, economic, or practical purpose beyond satisfying Caligula's desire to prove that he can accomplish anything, regardless of how pointless or expensive it might be. He begins construction of a palace extension that will physically connect his residence to the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Rome's most sacred shrine, because he's decided that as a god he should live in the same building as the other gods. The architectural challenges alone would bankrupt most kingdoms, but Caligula is unconcerned with practical limitations when divine prerogatives are at stake. But perhaps most tellingly, he builds elaborate temporary structures for single events, spending fortunes on entertainment venues that are demolished immediately after use. It's wasteful spending elevated to the level of art, a demonstration that he has so much power and wealth that he can literally throw them away for momentary amusement. The psychological effect of this behavior on the Roman elite is exactly what Caligula intends. It creates an atmosphere of complete unpredictability where traditional sources of security, wealth, family connections, military service, political achievement become meaningless because the emperor can destroy anyone at any time for any reason or no reason at all. You learn to recognize the signs that indicate Caligula's mood and adjust your behavior accordingly. When he's in his divine phase, you must remember to avert your eyes in his presence because looking directly at a god is sacrilege. When he's feeling playful, you must be prepared to participate in whatever game he's invented, even if it involves degrading yourself or your family for his entertainment. When he's angry, you must avoid his attention entirely, because rage makes him creative in ways that usually end with someone dying horribly. But the most dangerous mood is when he's bored, because boredom makes him inventive, and Caligula's inventions usually involve finding new ways to demonstrate his power over life and death. This is when he orders executions for entertainment value rather than political necessity. This is when he forces prominent Romans to fight as gladiators in the arena, betting on the outcomes and laughing at their fear. This is when he decides that certain senators need to be reminded of their place by being forced to run alongside his chariot for miles through the streets of Rome, while he mocks their exhaustion. The cruelty isn't just casual, it's systematic, designed to break down any sense that there are limits to what the emperor can do, or any refuge from his authority. Caligula understands that fear is most effective when it's unpredictable, when people can never feel safe because safety depends entirely on his momentary whims. He executes people for criticizing him, but he also executes people for praising him too, enthusiastically, because excessive flattery implies that he needs validation from inferiors. He punishes disloyalty, but he also punishes loyalty, because loyal subjects might feel entitled to rewards or consideration. He kills people for plotting against him, but he also kills people for not plotting against him, because their acceptance of his authority suggests they don't take him seriously as a threat. The logic is circular and impossible to navigate, which is exactly the point. When survival depends entirely on the emperor's unpredictable favor, no one can feel secure enough to challenge his authority or even question his decisions. But Caligula's cruelty isn't limited to political opponents or perceived threats. He extends it to his own family, his closest advisors, and anyone else who happens to catch his attention when he's in the mood for violence. He forces his uncle Claudius, a respected scholar and the future emperor, to endure constant humiliation and physical abuse, apparently finding it amusing to torment someone who can't defend himself due to his physical disabilities and stammering speech. He publicly mocks his grandmother Antonia, one of the most revered women in Rome, until she dies of what appears to be despair and exhaustion. Most notoriously, his relationship with his sisters transcends normal family bonds in ways that scandalize even Roman society, which is notably tolerant of sexual arrangements that would shock later civilizations. But beyond the personal scandal, these relationships serve a political purpose. They demonstrate that the emperor is literally above all laws, customs, and moral constraints that govern ordinary humans. When Romans see that their emperor openly violates the most fundamental taboos of their society without facing any consequences, they understand that he recognizes no limits whatsoever on his behavior. If he can disregard the basic rules that hold families and societies together, what other boundaries might he be willing to cross? The answer becomes clear as Caligula's reign progresses and his behavior becomes increasingly divorced from anything resembling rational self-interest or even basic human psychology. He begins appearing in public dressed as various gods, Jupiter, Neptune, Apollo, Mercury, and demanding that people worship him with the same reverence they show to traditional deities. This isn't just megalomania. It's a systematic attempt to redefine the relationship between ruler and ruled, transforming political authority into religious obligation. Roman religion had always been a civic duty rather than a personal faith, with emperors receiving divine honors after death but rarely claiming godhood while living. Caligula's innovation is to demand immediate divine recognition, forcing his subjects to choose between their traditional beliefs and their survival. He builds temples dedicated to his own worship and staffs them with priests whose job is to perform daily sacrifices to his divinity. He commissions statues of himself in the guise of various gods and has them placed in existing temples, often replacing traditional cult images that have been venerated for centuries. Most provocatively, he orders a statue of himself erected in the Temple of Jerusalem, knowing that this will provoke massive resistance from the Jewish population throughout the empire. The order is so inflammatory that even his own officials recognize its potential to cause empire-wide rebellion. But Caligula is unconcerned with practical consequences when his divine dignity is at stake. The Jerusalem statue order reveals something crucial about Caligula's psychology. He's not just seeking worship for its own sake, but actively looking for opportunities to demonstrate his power by forcing people to choose between their deepest beliefs and their lives. The more sacred something is to his subjects, the more valuable it becomes as a target for his authority. This pattern extends to his treatment of Roman traditions and institutions. The Senate, which had governed Rome for centuries before the imperial system was established, becomes a particular target for Caligula's contempt. He doesn't just ignore senatorial advice, he actively humiliates senators by forcing them to participate in degrading spectacles that mock their dignity and authority. He makes senators run beside his chariot like slaves or personal trainers. He forces them to attend banquets where they're served deliberately horrible food, while he enjoys elaborate delicacies. He holds mock trials where senators are prosecuted for imaginary crimes and forced to defend themselves with straight faces while Caligula openly laughs at the proceedings. The horse consul proposal is just the most famous example of this systematic degradation. By seriously suggesting that an animal should hold one of Rome's highest offices, Caligula is making it clear that senatorial rank is meaningless, that political achievement is worthless, and that traditional Roman values are obstacles to be swept away rather than foundations to be preserved. But even as he's destroying Rome's political culture, Caligula is also bankrupting its economy through spending that defies rational explanation. The temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples costs more than some provinces generate in annual revenue. The palace extensions require materials and labor that could build entire cities. The constant games and festivals consume resources that previous emperors had carefully hoarded for military emergencies. Within 2 years of taking power, Caligula has not only spent the enormous surplus left by Tiberius, but has pushed the imperial government into debt that threatens the stability of the entire monetary system. The debasement of currency needed to fund his projects creates inflation that affects every level of Roman society, from the wealthy elite who see their savings lose value, to common workers whose wages buy less food than they did just months earlier. The Didymion crisis forces Caligula to become even more creative in his methods of extracting wealth from his subjects. He begins charging admission to his palace, selling viewings of himself the way museums sell tickets to see rare artifacts. He auctions off gladiators at inflated prices and threatens anyone who doesn't bid enthusiastically with charges of treason. Most innovatively, he discovers that he can generate revenue by selling public offices to the highest bidder, regardless of their qualifications or suitability. Provincial governorships that traditionally go to experienced administrators are awarded to wealthy freedmen, whose only qualification is their ability to pay Caligula's asking price. The result is predictable: incompetent governance that creates unrest in the provinces, which requires military intervention, which costs money that the government doesn't have, which necessitates even more creative fundraising schemes in an ever-accelerating cycle of fiscal irresponsibility. But Caligula's response to these mounting problems isn't to reconsider his spending or moderate his behavior. Instead, he decides that the real issue is that the empire isn't wealthy enough to support his lifestyle, and the solution is to expand its boundaries through military conquest that will bring in enough plunder to fund his projects indefinitely. This decision launches what might be the most embarrassing military campaigns in Roman history, operations so poorly planned and executed that they become legendary examples of how not to conduct warfare. The first target is Germany, where Caligula decides to complete the conquests that his father Germanicus had begun before his suspicious death. It's a reasonable strategic objective that could potentially secure Rome's northern border, while providing opportunities for the kind of military glory that Caligula craves and needs to legitimize his increasingly unpopular rule. The campaign begins promisingly enough, with Caligula personally leading a substantial force across the Rhine into territory that hasn't seen Roman armies for nearly 2 decades. The logistical preparation is impressive, the troop quality is high, and the initial advance proceeds according to plan. But then Caligula's psychological peculiarities begin interfering with military necessity. He becomes obsessed with his personal safety, to the point where he refuses to engage in any operation that might involve actual combat. He spends days at a time in his tent claiming to be sick, while his generals wait for orders that never come. When intelligence reports suggest that Germanic tribes are organizing resistance to the Roman advance, Caligula's response is to declare victory and begin the return journey to Rome, apparently believing that his mere presence in Germany constitutes sufficient conquest to justify a triumph. But the most famous incident occurs when the army reaches the English Channel, and Caligula orders his troops to prepare for an invasion of Britain. The logistical challenges are significant, but not impossible. Julius Caesar had managed cross-channel operations a century earlier with much more primitive resources. However, when the moment comes to actually board ships and cross the water, Caligula seems to lose his nerve entirely. Instead of ordering the invasion, he commands his soldiers to collect seashells and other beach debris as spoils of war in his conflict with Neptune, god of the sea. The troops, professional soldiers who've spent months preparing for a legitimate military campaign, are forced to spend hours gathering shells and pebbles while their emperor proclaims victory over an imaginary divine enemy. It's difficult to imagine a more effective way to destroy military morale and professional pride in a single afternoon. The return to Rome is equally problematic, as Caligula insists on celebrating a triumph for victories that exist only in his imagination. The traditional triumph was Rome's highest military honor, reserved for generals who had achieved decisive victories over significant enemies under dangerous circumstances. Caligula's triumph celebrates his collection of seashells and his successful intimidation of Neptune. The parade includes Germanic prisoners who are actually Gauls recruited from Roman provinces and dressed to look like barbarian warriors. The captured enemy weapons are props manufactured in Roman workshops. The entire spectacle is so obviously fraudulent that even the Roman mob, usually enthusiastic about any entertainment that includes free food and wine, reacts with embarrassed silence rather than traditional cheering. But Caligula is either unaware of the crowd's response or indifferent to it. He's achieved his objective of demonstrating imperial power, and the fact that the demonstration is based on complete fiction is irrelevant to his psychological needs. This pattern of declaring victory in conflicts that exist only in his mind becomes a regular feature of Caligula's later reign. He announces the conquest of territories that Roman armies never visit. He claims to have defeated enemies who don't exist. He awards himself military honors for battles that never happened. The cumulative effect is to destroy the credibility of the imperial system itself. When the emperor openly lies about basic facts that can be verified by anyone who cares to investigate, the entire structure of government becomes a shared delusion that everyone pretends to believe because the alternative is too dangerous to contemplate. Your life as a senator during this period requires constant psychological adaptation to a reality that changes according to Caligula's whims rather than any external facts. You must remember that Germany has been conquered even though Roman armies never established permanent control there. You must acknowledge Caligula's divine status even though he's obviously human. You must participate in ceremonies honoring military victories that everyone knows never happened. The cognitive dissonance is exhausting, but it's also the point. Caligula understands that forcing people to publicly endorse obvious lies is more psychologically damaging than requiring them to accept truths they dislike. When someone makes you lie about reality, they're asserting control over your thought processes in ways that mere political authority cannot achieve. But even as he's systematically destroying Roman political culture, military credibility, and economic stability, Caligula's personal behavior is becoming increasingly erratic in ways that suggest genuine mental deterioration, rather than merely strategic cruelty. He begins having extended conversations with statues, apparently believing that the gods are speaking to him directly and providing guidance about imperial policy. He's often seen arguing with these silent figures, sometimes becoming angry enough to order their removal or destruction when they fail to provide satisfactory responses to his questions. His relationship with his favorite horse Incitatus transcends normal affection and enters territory that makes even jaded Roman aristocrats uncomfortable. He builds the animal a marble stall with an ivory manger and purple blankets. He throws dinner parties where Incitatus is the guest of honor, served elaborate meals while human guests are expected to treat the horse as if it were a distinguished senator. The horse consul proposal is simply the logical extension of this obsession. If Incitatus is worthy of dinner party honors and imperial attention, why shouldn't he hold political office? The fact that horses can't perform consular duties is irrelevant when imperial authority transcends rational limitations. But perhaps most tellingly, Caligula's personal habits become increasingly disconnected from normal human rhythms and needs. He stops maintaining regular sleep schedules, often staying awake for days at a time, and then sleeping for extended periods that disrupt government business. He develops eating patterns that alternate between elaborate binges and extended fasts, as if food is another area where he can demonstrate his transcendence of ordinary limitations. His sexual behavior, even by the tolerant standards of Roman society, becomes a source of scandal that reaches every level of the social hierarchy. But beyond the personal implications, these relationships serve a political purpose. They demonstrate that the emperor recognizes no boundaries whatsoever, that every person in the empire exists for his gratification, and that traditional concepts of marriage, family, and social propriety are meaningless when imperial desire is involved. The cumulative effect of all this behavior is to create an atmosphere of total unpredictability, where survival depends entirely on Caligula's momentary mood and no one can feel secure regardless of their wealth, status, or previous service to the empire. Roman society, which had been stable for generations despite occasional political upheavals, begins showing signs of fundamental breakdown. Traditional sources of authority, the Senate, the law courts, the military hierarchy, religious institutions, lose credibility when they're subject to arbitrary imperial interference. Economic relationships become uncertain when contracts and property rights can be voided by imperial whim. Most dangerously, the Praetorian Guard, the elite unit responsible for protecting the emperor, begins questioning whether their oath of loyalty extends to protecting someone who seems intent on destroying everything they've sworn to defend. The Praetorians are professional soldiers, men whose careers depend on the stability of the imperial system, and who have the most to lose if that system collapses. They're also the only force in Rome capable of effectively challenging imperial authority, since they have both the military capability and the access necessary to threaten the emperor personally. For the first 3 years of Caligula's reign, Praetorian loyalty holds despite growing concerns about his behavior. The guards are well paid, they benefit from imperial generosity, and their commander Macro is initially supportive of the young emperor. But as Caligula's behavior becomes more extreme and more threatening to the stability of the empire, even the Praetorians begin reconsidering their position. The breaking point comes when Caligula's paranoia, always a feature of his personality, begins focusing on the guard itself. He starts suspecting that the Praetorians are plotting against him, which leads him to implement security measures that are both insulting and impractical. He requires guards to submit to searches before entering his presence. He rotates assignments frequently to prevent the development of personal relationships that might lead to conspiracy. He begins using Germanic bodyguards as a counterweight to Praetorian influence, explicitly telling people that he trusts foreigners more than Romans. Most fatally, he makes it clear that he considers the Praetorian Guard expendable, and that their loyalty, no matter how demonstrated, will never be sufficient to guarantee their safety. When people understand that faithful service provides no protection from arbitrary execution, the rational response is to consider alternatives to faithful service. The conspiracy that finally forms against Caligula isn't motivated by political ideology or personal ambition. It's a survival response by people who understand that the emperor's continued reign threatens not just their own lives, but the stability of the entire empire. The key figure is Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian tribune whose military record is exemplary, but who has become a particular target for Caligula's mockery. Chaerea is an older man, a veteran of the Germanic campaigns under Tiberius, and Caligula apparently finds it amusing to humiliate him with sexual innuendos and questions about his masculinity. The harassment might be bearable if it were merely personal, but Caligula conducts these sessions in public, making Chaerea's humiliation a form of entertainment for court audiences. For a professional soldier whose career has been built on respect and authority, this treatment is not just personally degrading but professionally destructive. But Chaerea's motivation isn't just personal revenge, it's institutional preservation. He understands that Caligula's reign is destroying the foundations of Roman government, and that someone needs to act before the damage becomes irreversible. The conspiracy that develops around Chaerea includes other Praetorian officers, senators who've been personally threatened by the emperor, and court officials who understand that the current situation is unsustainable. But it's a small group, carefully selected for reliability rather than size, because the risks of discovery are enormous, and the consequences of failure would be death in ways too horrible to contemplate. The planning is meticulous, taking advantage of the conspirators' intimate knowledge of palace routines and security procedures. They identify a moment when Caligula will be relatively isolated, plan escape routes for after the assassination, and coordinate with potential successors who can restore stability once the immediate crisis is resolved. The date they choose is January 24, 41 CE, during the Palatine Games, when Caligula will be attending theatrical performances in a temporary venue connected to the palace. The location offers opportunities for private access while providing crowd noise to mask any disturbance. On the morning of the assassination, there are omens that suggest divine approval for the conspiracy. Caligula himself seems unusually nervous, apparently aware that something is wrong but unable to identify the specific threat. He considers cancelling his public appearances but ultimately decides to proceed with his scheduled activities. The actual assassination unfolds quickly and decisively. As Caligula leaves the theatre through a narrow corridor, Charia and his co-conspirators surround him and attack with swords and daggers. The emperor, for all his claims of divine status, dies like any mortal man, quickly, bloodily, and with expressions of very human fear and pain. But the conspirators' work isn't finished with Caligula's death. They also kill his wife Caesonia and their infant daughter, understanding that leaving potential heirs alive would create opportunities for future civil war. It's a brutal but necessary decision that eliminates the immediate Julio-Claudian succession while clearing the way for more stable leadership. The immediate aftermath of the assassination reveals just how thoroughly Caligula had alienated every significant group in Roman society. The Senate's initial response is to celebrate and discuss the possibility of restoring the Republic. The Praetorian Guard accepts the fait accompli and begins negotiations with potential successors. The Roman mob, despite their previous enthusiasm for Caligula's games and spectacles, shows little grief for his passing. Most tellingly, the provincial armies and governors make no effort to avenge their dead emperor or challenge the legitimacy of his assassination. The man who had claimed divine status and demanded universal worship dies unmourned and undefended, his death creating relief rather than outrage throughout the empire. The power vacuum is quickly filled by Claudius, Caligula's uncle, who had survived the previous reign through a combination of genuine scholarship, apparent political harmlessness, and sheer luck. Claudius inherits an empire that's been financially devastated, politically demoralized, and institutionally damaged by 4 years of insane leadership. But he also inherits an empire that's desperate for competent government and willing to support anyone who can provide stability, justice, and rational administration. The contrast between Caligula's arbitrary cruelty and Claudius's scholarly temperament is so dramatic that the new emperor seems brilliant simply by virtue of being sane. The restoration of normal government reveals the full extent of the damage Caligula had inflicted on Roman society. The treasury is not just empty, but actively in debt to creditors throughout the Mediterranean. The military's morale and discipline have been undermined by years of pointless campaigns and fraudulent victories. The relationship between the imperial government and the provinces has been poisoned by arbitrary taxation and incompetent administration. Most seriously, the precedent of imperial assassination has been established. Future emperors will understand that their power, however absolute it might seem, ultimately depends on the consent of the Praetorian Guard, and that this consent can be withdrawn if their behavior becomes sufficiently threatening to the empire's stability. But perhaps the most lasting damage is to the concept of imperial legitimacy itself. Caligula's reign had demonstrated that inheriting divine authority doesn't automatically confer wisdom, competence, or even basic sanity. The imperial system, which had been presented as a natural evolution from republican chaos, is revealed to be only as good as the individual who happens to hold power at any given moment. This understanding will haunt the Roman Empire for the remainder of its existence. Future emperors will be constantly evaluated not just for their policies but for their mental stability. The nobility will always be watching for signs that unlimited power is corrupting their ruler beyond the point of public safety. The military will understand that their ultimate loyalty is to the empire rather than to any individual emperor. In a sense, Caligula's greatest historical achievement is negative. He demonstrated so clearly what absolute power could do to a human being that he made future restraints on imperial authority seem not just desirable but essential for survival. The lessons of his reign extend far beyond ancient Rome. Every subsequent civilization that has experimented with unlimited political authority has had to grapple with the questions his rule raises. How much power can any individual safely wield? What safeguards are necessary to prevent authority from corrupting those who exercise it? How can societies protect themselves from leaders whose personal pathologies threaten collective survival? These questions remain relevant today, in an age when technology has made the potential consequences of unlimited power far more dangerous than anything Caligula could have imagined. Modern weapons, communication systems, and economic networks create opportunities for destruction that make the damage one insane Roman emperor could inflict seem almost quaint by comparison. But the fundamental psychological dynamics remain unchanged. Power still corrupts, authority still attracts people who shouldn't wield it, and societies still struggle to create systems that can contain the ambitions of those who seek to transcend all limitations on their behavior. Standing in that Roman Senate chamber watching Caligula propose making his horse a consul while senators nod in terrified agreement, you're witnessing something that transcends historical curiosity. You're seeing the moment when a civilization discovers that its most fundamental assumptions about leadership, authority, and human nature might be catastrophically wrong. Because the truly terrifying thing about Caligula isn't that he was uniquely evil or exceptionally cruel. It's that he was in many ways simply an ordinary young man who found himself in an extraordinary position with no meaningful constraints on his behavior. The monster who emerges over the course of his reign isn't born fully formed, it's created through the gradual erosion of every boundary that might have kept his worst impulses in check. You remember the early days of his reign when Romans celebrated his accession with genuine enthusiasm and optimism. The young man who walked through Rome's streets greeting citizens personally, who restored exiles and released prisoners, who seemed to embody everything noble about imperial leadership. That person wasn't pretending to be decent. He was decent, or at least capable of decency when circumstances encouraged it. But decency, you've learned, is often more fragile than people want to believe. It depends on feedback mechanisms that provide consequences for bad behavior and rewards for good judgment. It requires social structures that can resist individual pathology rather than amplifying it. Most importantly, it needs limits, boundaries that even the most powerful people cannot cross without facing meaningful resistance. Caligula's tragedy, and Rome's catastrophe, is that he inherited a position with no effective limits at all. The Senate had been reduced to an advisory body with no real power to constrain imperial decisions. The law courts operated at the emperor's pleasure and could be overruled by imperial decree. The military served the emperor personally rather than the state abstractly, and their oath of loyalty was to him rather than to any constitutional principle. Even the financial constraints that might have forced moderation were meaningless when the emperor could simply confiscate property, debase currency, or extort money from subjects who had no legal recourse against imperial demands. In such a system, the only thing protecting Roman society from imperial pathology was the personal character of whoever happened to hold power. And personal character, as Caligula's reign demonstrates, is not a reliable foundation for political stability when it's the only foundation available. The Senate session continues around you, with Caligula now explaining the administrative advantages of having a horse as consul. Incitatus, he argues, would be incorruptible, because horses have no interest in monetary gain. The animal would be impartial because horses don't form political alliances or harbor personal grudges. Most importantly, a horse consul would be completely loyal to the emperor, because horses, unlike humans, don't harbor ambitions for higher office. The logic is simultaneously absurd and horrifyingly coherent. If you accept the premise that the emperor's will is the only legitimate source of authority, then his choice of advisors becomes irrelevant to anyone except the emperor himself. Why shouldn't he consult his horse if that's what pleases him? Why shouldn't he make a horse consul if that demonstrates his unlimited power more effectively than appointing another ambitious senator? The senators around you are nodding gravely, some even offering elaborations on Caligula's theme. Marcus Aurelius Scaurus suggests that Incitatus could be given a villa in the fashionable district, funded by a special tax on horse owners throughout the empire. Lucius Vitellius proposes that the horse be granted a retinue of human servants, whose job would be to interpret its wishes and translate them into policy recommendations. It's political theatre of the most degrading kind, a performance designed to demonstrate that Roman senators are willing to endorse any absurdity rather than risk imperial displeasure. But it's also something more sinister, a systematic destruction of the dignity and authority that had made the Senate a respected institution for centuries. When senators are forced to seriously discuss the qualifications of livestock for high office, they're not just being humiliated personally, they're participating in the destruction of the entire concept of merit-based governance. The idea that political authority should be based on competence, experience, and demonstrated judgment, rather than arbitrary imperial favor. This destruction of institutional dignity extends throughout Roman government. During Caligula's reign, the law courts become venues for entertainment rather than justice, with trials conducted as theatrical performances, where the verdict is determined by the emperor's mood, rather than evidence or legal precedent. Provincial governorships are awarded to the highest bidder rather than the most qualified candidate, turning administration into a form of imperial fundraising. Most corrosively, the military begins to lose its professional character as Caligula uses the legions for personal projects rather than strategic necessities. Professional soldiers find themselves building pleasure palaces instead of fortifications, collecting seashells instead of fighting enemies, participating in fake triumphs instead of earning real victories. The cumulative effect is to transform Roman government from a functional administrative system into an elaborate mechanism for satisfying one man's psychological needs. Every institution becomes subordinated to imperial whim, every decision becomes arbitrary, and every citizen becomes vulnerable to treatment that would have been unthinkable under a system that recognized legal constraints on political power. But the most insidious aspect of Caligula's rule is how it changes the people who are forced to participate in it. You watch senators who had been respected for their integrity learning to flatter shamelessly and endorse obvious lies. You see military officers who had built careers on professional competence becoming skilled at theatrical displays that mock their own expertise. You observe administrators who had taken pride in efficient governance adapting to a system where efficiency is less important than entertainment value. The psychological toll of this adaptation is enormous. When people are forced to act against their principles regularly, they begin to lose touch with what those principles actually are. When survival depends on successful deception, deception becomes a habit that extends beyond immediate necessity. When authority is arbitrary, people stop believing in the possibility of justice altogether. You find yourself changing too, in ways that would have horrified the young senator who first entered Roman politics with idealistic goals about public service and civic duty. You've learnt to read Caligula's moods and adjust your behavior accordingly. You've developed the ability to participate in absurd conversations with a straight face. You've mastered the art of appearing enthusiastic about policies you know are destructive. Most troublingly, you've discovered that you're capable of remaining silent while terrible things happen to people who probably don't deserve them, because speaking out would accomplish nothing except adding your name to the list of those who need to be eliminated. This moral compromise position is shared by virtually everyone in Caligula's government, creating a collective complicity that makes resistance seem both impossible and pointless. When everyone is implicated in the system's corruption, no one feels qualified to challenge it. When everyone has something to hide, no one can afford to take moral stands that might invite investigation. The emperor understands this dynamic and uses it skillfully to maintain control. By forcing people to participate in activities that compromise their integrity, he creates a network of mutual blackmail that makes organized opposition extremely difficult. Who can lead a rebellion against imperial corruption when they've personally benefited from that corruption? Who can claim moral authority to challenge the emperor when they've publicly endorsed his most outrageous policies? This is why the conspiracy that finally forms against Caligula takes so long to develop and remains so small despite widespread dissatisfaction with his rule. The very system he's created to maintain power also makes it dangerous for his enemies to trust each other enough to coordinate effective resistance. Cassius Chaerea and his fellow conspirators succeed precisely because they're able to overcome this mutual suspicion through a combination of personal relationships, shared military experience, and the understanding that the empire's survival depends on removing an emperor who's become actively dangerous to Roman civilization. But even their success is limited and temporary. While they manage to eliminate Caligula himself, they can't immediately repair the institutional damage his reign has caused, or restore the social trust that arbitrary rule has destroyed. The transition to Claudius is relatively smooth, precisely because Romans are so desperate for competent government that they're willing to accept almost anyone who seems capable of rational administration. But Claudius inherits problems that extend far beyond the immediate crisis of imperial succession. The financial devastation is obvious and quantifiable. Empty treasuries, debased currency, unsustainable debt levels that threaten the stability of the entire monetary system. The military demoralization is serious but manageable. Professional soldiers can be retrained and re-equipped, and successful campaigns can restore confidence in Roman arms. But the deeper problems are psychological and cultural, involving trust, authority, and the basic assumptions that hold societies together. How do you restore respect for institutions that have been systematically mocked and degraded? How do you rebuild social cohesion when people have learned that survival depends on deception and that authority is arbitrary? These questions don't have easy answers, and Claudius's reign demonstrates both the possibilities and the limitations of reform in the aftermath of systemic corruption. He's able to restore basic administrative competence and military effectiveness, but he can't entirely eliminate the precedents that Caligula's reign has established. Future emperors will always know that imperial power, properly used, can transcend any limitation that Roman society might try to impose. Future subjects will always remember that their lives, property, and dignity exist at imperial pleasure, rather than as natural rights protected by law. Future institutions will always be vulnerable to arbitrary interference by anyone who controls the mechanisms of government. Most importantly, the Praetorian Guard will always understand that their ultimate loyalty is to their own survival rather than to any individual emperor, and that this survival might occasionally require them to assassinate the very person they're sworn to protect. This creates a permanent instability at the heart of the imperial system, a constant tension between the theoretical absoluteness of imperial authority and the practical limitations imposed by the need to maintain the consent of key constituencies. Subsequent emperors handle this tension with varying degrees of skill and success. Some, like Marcus Aurelius, manage to wield enormous power while maintaining the respect and loyalty of their subjects through competent administration and personal virtue. Others, like Nero and Commodus, repeat aspects of Caligula's pathology and face similar consequences, but none can escape entirely from the precedents his reign established or the questions it raised about the nature of political authority itself. The ghost of Caligula haunts every subsequent imperial administration, a reminder of what unlimited power can do to human beings and what human beings with unlimited power can do to civilizations. As you sit in that Senate chamber, listening to serious discussions about the administrative arrangements necessary for a horse consul, you're not just witnessing the degradation of Roman political culture, you're seeing a case study in how quickly and completely civilized societies can unravel when their fundamental assumptions about power, authority, and human nature prove to be wrong. The lesson isn't that Romans were uniquely susceptible to this kind of collapse, but rather that the psychological and institutional dynamics that destroyed Roman liberty are universally human. Any society that concentrates unlimited power in the hands of individuals who lack effective constraints on their behavior is vulnerable to the same kind of systematic destruction that Caligula inflicted on the empire he inherited. The safeguards that modern democratic societies have developed, constitutional limitations, institutional checks and balances, regular elections, independent courts, free press, represent humanity's collective attempt to learn from experiences like Caligula's reign and prevent their repetition. But these safeguards are only as strong as the people who maintain them, and they require constant vigilance against the eternal human temptation to trade freedom for the promise of efficient government under strong leadership. The senators around you are still discussing the horse consul proposal, their voices growing more animated as they compete to offer the most creative suggestions for how Incitus might exercise his new authority. Some propose that the horse should have a special stable built within the Senate House itself, so that he can attend meetings regularly and provide immediate input on important legislation. Others suggest that Incitatus should be given a vote on major policy decisions, with his preferences determined by offering him different colored feed buckets and observing which one he chooses to eat from first. The metaphorical implications are lost on no one. If the consul's preferences can be determined by observing his feeding habits, what does that say about the intellectual demands of high office? Caligula listens to these suggestions with the pleased expression of someone whose entertainment needs are being met adequately. But you can see in his eyes that this isn't just amusement, it's calculation. He's using this absurd discussion to test the limits of senatorial compliance and to identify which senators are most willing to embrace obvious absurdity in exchange for imperial favor. The senators who offer the most creative elaborations on the horse consul theme are marking themselves as completely reliable instruments of imperial will, people who can be trusted to endorse any policy regardless of its content or consequences. The senators who remain silent or offer only minimal contributions are identifying themselves as potential problems who might retain enough integrity to resist future demands. It's a brilliant psychological sorting mechanism disguised as imperial whimsy, and it demonstrates that even at his most apparently irrational, Caligula retains the cunning necessary to maintain political control over people who should, theoretically, be his intellectual superiors. This combination of madness and calculation is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of his personality. If he were simply insane, his behavior would be tragic but comprehensible. If he were simply evil, his actions would be horrifying but predictable. But the mixture of genuine psychological pathology with sophisticated political intelligence creates something far more dangerous than either pure madness or pure malevolence. He understands exactly what he's doing to Roman society and why it's effective. But he also genuinely believes that his divine status entitles him to reshape civilization according to his personal fantasies. He's simultaneously the victim of his own delusions and the architect of a system designed to protect and enable those delusions. This paradox makes him nearly impossible to predict or contain through conventional political methods. Traditional approaches to managing difficult rulers, negotiation, compromise, the gradual modification of policies through patient persuasion, are useless when dealing with someone who recognizes no legitimate constraints on his authority and who views any attempt at limitation as evidence of treasonous disloyalty. The only effective responses are complete submission or complete resistance, and complete resistance requires the kind of coordinated action that's almost impossible to organize under a system where everyone is constantly being watched and where the consequences of discovery are literally unbearable. As the Senate session continues, you find yourself calculating the distances to various exits and wondering whether Cassius Chaerea's conspiracy is real or just another rumor in a city that's become addicted to speculation about palace intrigue. The whispers have been circulating for weeks now, carefully coded conversations about the need for administrative changes and institutional reforms that might restore traditional Roman values. You want to believe that someone is finally taking action to end this nightmare, but you've learned to be skeptical of optimistic rumors in a political environment where hope is usually followed by disappointment, and disappointment is often followed by death. The meeting finally ends when Caligula announces that he's bored with governance and wants to return to his palace for an afternoon of theatrical performances. The horse consul proposal is officially tabled pending further consideration, which in practical terms means it will be forgotten until the emperor decides to revive it for his entertainment. As you file out of the Senate House with your colleagues, you catch fragments of whispered conversations that suggest today's session has pushed even the most compliant senators close to their breaking point. The forced participation in obvious absurdity is one thing when it's occasional, but when it becomes the primary function of Rome's highest legislative body, even the most pragmatic politicians begin questioning whether their survival strategy is sustainable. The walk back to your own villa takes you through streets that still show the physical magnificence that has made Rome the envy of the civilized world. The marble facades, the elaborate fountains, the carefully maintained gardens, all the visible symbols of imperial prosperity remain intact, despite the political chaos that's consuming the government. But if you look more carefully, you can see signs of the deeper problems that Caligula's reign has created. The shops that once catered to wealthy tourists from throughout the empire now display reduced inventories because international trade has been disrupted by political uncertainty. The public works projects that once employed thousands of craftsmen have been abandoned in favor of the emperor's personal building schemes. Most tellingly, the streets themselves feel different, less confident, less secure, more anxious. People move quickly and avoid making eye contact with strangers. Conversations are conducted in lowered voices. Even the slaves and freedmen who make up the bulk of Rome's population seem more nervous than usual, as if they understand that social stability depends on political stability, and that political stability has become a luxury that Rome can no longer afford. Your own household reflects these broader tensions. Your steward reports that several of your tenant farmers have requested permission to relocate to other provinces, apparently believing that distance from Rome might provide some protection against imperial attention. Your wine merchant mentions that his suppliers in Gaul are demanding payment in silver rather than Roman currency because they're concerned about continuing debasement. Most ominously, your personal secretary informs you that he's received informal inquiries from agents who claim to be conducting routine administrative surveys but who seem unusually interested in your family's political connections and financial resources. These aren't necessarily signs of immediate danger, but they're indicators of a system under stress, a society where normal relationships are being strained by the unpredictability of government policy. and the arbitrary nature of imperial justice. As evening approaches, and you prepare for another night of uncertainty about what tomorrow might bring, you find yourself thinking about the lessons that future generations might draw from Rome's current crisis. What would you tell people who live in more stable times about the fragility of civilized society and the speed with which it can unravel when its fundamental assumptions prove incorrect? The answer, you realize, isn't about the specific details of Roman politics or the particular pathology of one emperor. It's about the eternal human tendency to create systems that concentrate power in ways that make abuse inevitable, and then to act surprised when that abuse actually occurs. Every civilization faces the same basic challenge: how to create enough authority to maintain order and prosperity, while preventing that authority from becoming so concentrated that it can destroy the very things it's meant to protect. Rome's solution, the imperial system, had seemed brilliant when it was guided by competent and relatively virtuous leaders like Augustus and Tiberius. But Caligula's reign reveals the fatal flaw in any system that depends on the personal character of individual leaders, rather than institutional safeguards that can constrain destructive behavior, regardless of who happens to hold power. The irony is that Romans understood this principle perfectly when it came to their republican institutions. The elaborate system of checks and balances that had governed the Republic for centuries was specifically designed to prevent any individual or faction from accumulating enough power to threaten the liberty of citizens. But the imperial system had gradually eroded these safeguards in the name of efficiency and stability, concentrating authority in ways that made effective governance possible, but also made catastrophic governance inevitable when the wrong person inherited ultimate power. As you settle into your private study and try to focus on routine correspondence, you can hear in the distance the sounds of another imperial celebration, music, laughter, and the occasional crash of expensive objects being destroyed for entertainment. Caligula is hosting another of his legendary dinner parties, the kind of event where the wine flows freely, the conversation becomes increasingly surreal, and the morning usually brings news of deaths, bankruptcies, or other casualties of imperial amusement. You've learned not to accept invitations to these gatherings unless attendance is specifically commanded, because voluntary participation in imperial madness can be just as dangerous as involuntary resistance to it. The emperor's favorites are often the next day's victims, and his victims are sometimes the next day's favorites. But either position is more dangerous than the obscurity that comes from avoiding imperial attention altogether. The sounds of celebration continue long into the night, a reminder that while Rome's political system is disintegrating and its social fabric is fraying, the man responsible for this destruction is genuinely enjoying himself. He's not suffering from his delusions, he's reveling in them, because they've created a world where every desire can be satisfied immediately, and every whim can be transformed into imperial policy. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of tyranny. It's often pleasant for the tyrant himself. The destruction that unlimited power inflicts on society doesn't necessarily create negative feedback that might encourage moderation. Instead, it can create a cycle of escalating indulgence where each successful transgression against normal limitations makes the next transgression seem reasonable and necessary. Caligula isn't being driven to madness by the pressures of office. He's being enabled in madness by the removal of all external pressures that might force him to confront reality. The imperial system has created a perfect bubble where his fantasies are treated as facts, his delusions are enforced as law, and his pathology is celebrated as divine wisdom. Breaking out of such a bubble requires external force, because the internal incentives all point toward deeper immersion in delusion rather than painful contact with reality. This is why reform from within becomes impossible once corruption reaches a certain point, and why the only solutions involve either complete collapse or revolutionary change imposed from outside the system. As you finally drift off to sleep, you're dimly aware that tomorrow will bring another day of navigating the impossible demands of serving in a government that's become indistinguishable from organized insanity. Another day of pretending that horses make reasonable political advisors, that seashells constitute military trophies, and that a man who demands worship as a living god deserves anything other than the swift death that Cassius Chaerea is reportedly planning to deliver. And in the morning, if the rumors are true, you'll wake up in a different world, one where sanity has been restored through violence, where institutional dignity might be gradually rebuilt, and where the Roman Empire can begin the long process of recovering from its encounter with unlimited power, wielded by unlimited madness. But that's tomorrow's possibility. Tonight Caligula still rules, Rome still suffers, and the greatest civilization in human history continues its experiment with the proposition that one man's will can safely substitute for law, tradition, and collective wisdom. The experiment is almost over. The results, as any reasonable observer might have predicted, have been catastrophic, but the lessons learned will echo through history for as long as human beings continue to struggle with the eternal problem of how much power any individual can safely wield, and what safeguards are necessary to protect society from those who believe themselves exempt from the limitations that govern ordinary mortals. Sleep comes fitfully, filled with dreams of horses wearing senatorial togas and emperors drowning in seashells they've collected from imaginary battles with gods who exist only in their own minds. The morning brings news that changes everything, delivered by your most trusted servant with the kind of hushed urgency that suggests either catastrophe or salvation. Cassius Chaerea has acted. The conspiracy that had seemed like wishful thinking just hours ago has become reality with the swift efficiency that only professional soldiers can achieve when they've finally decided that their duty to Rome supersedes their oath to any individual emperor. Caligula is dead, not from divine judgment or natural causes, but from 30 wounds inflicted by men who had sworn to protect him but who ultimately chose to protect the empire from him instead. The details, as they filter through the city over the next few hours, reveal just how completely the emperor had alienated even his closest associates. The assassination occurred in the narrow corridor connecting the palace to the theatre where Caligula had been attending the Palatine Games. Chaerea and his fellow conspirators had waited until the emperor was isolated from the Germanic bodyguards he'd begun favoring over the Praetorian Guard, then struck with the coordinated precision of a military operation. But perhaps most tellingly, when Caligula's Germanic guards discovered their master's body and began searching for his killers, they found no support from anyone else in the palace complex. The senators, who had spent years nodding along with his delusions, made no effort to avenge his death. The court officials who had prospered under his reign showed no loyalty to his memory. Even the palace slaves who had served him daily offered no assistance to those seeking to punish his assassins. The man who had demanded worship as a living god died unmourned and undefended, his death creating relief rather than outrage throughout the empire he had terrorized for 4 years. Your own reaction surprises you with its complexity. There's relief, certainly, the kind of profound exhale that comes when an unbearable tension is suddenly released. There's also apprehension about what comes next, because the death of any emperor creates uncertainty about succession and the potential for civil war. But underneath these immediate practical concerns, there's something darker and more troubling: the recognition that you've become someone who can feel genuine satisfaction at news of another human being's violent death. Caligula was a monster, but he was also a young man who might have been different under different circumstances, and the fact that you can celebrate his murder suggests changes in your own character that would have horrified your younger self. This moral complexity is shared by virtually everyone in Roman society who had been forced to participate in or witness Caligula's reign. The emperor's death removes an immediate threat, but it also forces people to confront their own complicity in the system that had enabled his behavior. How much responsibility do senators bear for failing to resist policies they knew were destructive? How culpable are administrators who efficiently implemented orders they understood to be arbitrary and cruel? What about citizens who cheered at games funded by extorted wealth, or soldiers who followed commands they recognized as militarily pointless? These questions don't have comfortable answers, and they help explain why the immediate aftermath of Caligula's assassination is marked by confusion and uncertainty rather than celebration. Romans want to return to normal government, but they're not entirely sure what normal means anymore, or whether it's even possible to restore institutions that have been so thoroughly degraded. The Praetorian Guard's solution to the succession crisis demonstrates both the practical realities of imperial power and the limitations of institutional reform. Rather than attempting to restore the Republic or implement constitutional limitations on imperial authority, they simply choose a new emperor, Claudius, Caligula's uncle, who had survived the previous reign through a combination of apparent harmlessness and genuine scholarly interests. Claudius represents everything that Caligula was not: serious, where his nephew had been frivolous; scholarly, where he had been impulsive; respectful of tradition, where he had been contemptuous of established customs. The contrast is so dramatic that his accession seems to promise an immediate return to competent government and rational administration. But Claudius also inherits problems that go far beyond the immediate crisis of imperial succession. The financial devastation is quantifiable: empty treasuries, debased currency, massive debts that threaten the stability of the entire monetary system. The military demoralization is serious but manageable. Professional soldiers can be retrained and refocused on legitimate strategic objectives. The deeper damage is psychological and institutional, involving trust, authority, and the basic assumptions that hold complex societies together. How do you restore respect for institutions that have been systematically mocked? How do you rebuild social cohesion when people have learned that survival depends on deception and that authority is arbitrary? Claudius addresses these challenges with the methodical approach of a scholar who understands that sustainable solutions require attention to underlying causes, rather than merely treating symptoms. He begins by demonstrating that the new regime will operate according to different principles than its predecessor. The horse consul proposal is quietly abandoned without formal announcement, allowing everyone to pretend it had never been seriously considered. The treasury confiscations that had funded Caligula's extravagances are reversed where possible, with property returned to families who can prove legitimate ownership. The arbitrary executions are replaced by legal proceedings that follow established procedures and produce verdicts based on evidence rather than imperial whim. Most importantly, Claudius makes it clear that he considers himself bound by law and tradition rather than elevated above them. He consults the Senate on major policy decisions, seeks advice from experienced administrators, and generally behaves like someone who understands that effective leadership requires cooperation rather than coercion. The restoration of normal government reveals the full extent of the damage that 4 years of arbitrary rule had inflicted on Roman society. The treasury is not just empty, but actively in debt to creditors throughout the Mediterranean. The military's morale and discipline have been undermined by pointless campaigns and fraudulent victories. The relationship between the imperial government and the provinces has been poisoned by incompetent administration and extractive taxation. But perhaps most seriously, the precedent of imperial assassination has been established. Future emperors will understand that their power, however absolute it might seem in theory, ultimately depends on the consent of key constituencies who retain the ability to withdraw that consent through violence if necessary. This creates a permanent tension at the heart of the imperial system, a constant awareness that unlimited authority is actually quite limited by the practical necessities of maintaining support from groups capable of effective resistance. Claudius handles this tension skillfully, understanding that his legitimacy depends not just on the Praetorian Guard's initial support, but on his ability to demonstrate that his reign serves the broader interests of Roman society. He implements policies designed to restore prosperity, rebuild institutional credibility, and provide the kind of competent administration that makes people grateful for stable government. But he can never entirely escape the shadow of his predecessor, or the questions that Caligula's reign had raised about the nature of imperial authority itself. Every decision he makes is evaluated not just for its immediate consequences, but for its potential to create precedents that future emperors might abuse. This scrutiny extends to areas of imperial behavior that had previously been considered private matters. Caligula's personal conduct had been so scandalous that Romans now pay attention to their emperor's private lives in ways that would have seemed inappropriate under previous reigns. The emperor's relationships with family members, his entertainment preferences, his religious practices, his personal financial management, all become subjects of public concern, because Romans have learned that imperial character flaws can have catastrophic public consequences. This represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between ruler and ruled, transforming the emperor from a distant figure whose personal qualities were largely irrelevant to governance, into someone whose every action is scrutinized for signs of potential pathology. Claudius adapts to this new reality by maintaining personal habits that are deliberately modest and conventional. He lives simply, spends carefully, treats family members with appropriate respect, and generally behaves like someone who understands that imperial dignity depends on imperial restraint. But the very fact that such restraint is necessary and noteworthy demonstrates how completely Caligula's reign had altered Roman expectations about imperial behavior. What had once been taken for granted, that emperors would govern rationally and treat their subjects with basic decency, now requires constant demonstration and vigilant maintenance. Your own life during Claudius's early reign reflects these broader changes in Roman political culture. The Senate sessions that had become exercises in absurdist theatre under Caligula are transformed back into serious policy discussions, where senators can express genuine opinions without fearing for their lives. The administrative work that had been subordinated to imperial entertainment becomes focused once again on practical governance, managing provincial affairs, maintaining infrastructure, coordinating military deployments, and handling the countless details that keep a vast empire functioning effectively. But you also notice more subtle changes in how people interact with each other and with government institutions. There's a wariness that wasn't there before Caligula's reign, a constant awareness that political stability is fragile, and that even well-intentioned leaders can be replaced by dangerous ones. Senators who had learned to flatter shamelessly don't immediately abandon those habits just because flattery is no longer necessary for survival. Administrators who had adapted to arbitrary decision-making don't instantly regain confidence in long-term planning. Citizens who had learned to avoid political engagement don't immediately return to civic participation. The psychological damage inflicted by arbitrary rule proves more persistent than the institutional damage, because it involves changes in fundamental assumptions about how society works and whether individual actions can have meaningful consequences. This creates ongoing challenges for Claudius's administration as it attempts to rebuild not just effective government, but public confidence in the possibility of effective government. People need to believe that their efforts will be rewarded, that their property will be protected, and that their participation in civic life will be valued rather than punished. Rebuilding this kind of social trust requires more than just competent administration. It requires sustained demonstration over time that the new regime operates according to consistent principles rather than arbitrary whims. Every policy decision, every judicial ruling, every administrative action becomes part of a broader project of convincing Romans that their government has returned to rational foundations. The process is gradual and often frustrating, because trust is much easier to destroy than to rebuild. But Claudius's patient approach begins to show results as people gradually regain confidence in institutions that had seemed permanently corrupted by Caligula's reign. Economic activity increases as merchants regain confidence in currency stability and contractual enforcement. Provincial administration improves as governors understand that competence will be rewarded rather than arbitrary loyalty. Military morale recovers as soldiers are deployed on legitimate strategic missions rather than theatrical displays. Most importantly, the basic fabric of Roman society begins to repair itself as people rediscover the benefits of cooperation, honest dealing, and civic engagement that had been subordinated to survival strategies during the previous reign. But the memory of Caligula's reign continues to influence Roman political culture in ways that extend far beyond Claudius's immediate reforms. The experience of living under arbitrary rule creates a permanent awareness of how quickly civilized society can unravel when its fundamental assumptions prove incorrect. This awareness manifests in various ways throughout Roman society. Legal scholars begin developing theories about constitutional limitations on imperial power, seeking ways to prevent future emperors from accumulating the kind of unlimited authority that had made Caligula's excesses possible. Military leaders implement reforms designed to ensure that army loyalty serves Roman interests rather than personal imperial ambitions, creating institutional safeguards against the kind of arbitrary deployment that had characterized the Germanic and British campaigns. Philosophers and historians begin analyzing the psychological dynamics of absolute power, trying to understand how decent people can be transformed into monsters when they're freed from all external constraints on their behavior. These intellectual developments represent Roman society's attempt to learn from its traumatic experience and develop safeguards against its repetition. But they also reveal the limitations of institutional reform when it comes to preventing individual pathology from corrupting political systems. Because the fundamental problem isn't that Roman institutions were inadequately designed, it's that any system that concentrates ultimate authority in individual hands is vulnerable to individual character flaws, and character flaws can't be eliminated through constitutional engineering. The best that institutional design can accomplish is to create mechanisms that limit the damage that individual pathology can inflict, and provide ways to remove dangerous leaders before their behavior becomes catastrophic. But these mechanisms depend on the willingness of key constituencies to act against their immediate interests in service of longer-term stability. The Praetorian Guard's decision to assassinate Caligula demonstrates that such willingness can exist under extreme circumstances, but it also reveals the dangers inherent in making military force the ultimate arbiter of political legitimacy. Future emperors will always know that their authority depends not just on constitutional mandate or popular support, but on their ability to maintain the loyalty of armed forces capable of deposing them. This creates incentives for imperial behavior that prioritize military satisfaction over broader governance needs. Claudius manages this challenge by ensuring that military interests align with effective governance, implementing policies that provide professional soldiers with meaningful work, appropriate rewards, and clear career advancement opportunities. But the underlying tension between military power and civilian authority remains unresolved. The same dynamic applies to other key constituencies whose support is necessary for imperial stability. The Senate's cooperation depends on being treated with respect and allowed meaningful participation in governance. The provincial elite's loyalty requires policies that protect their interests and provide opportunities for advancement within the imperial system. Most challengingly, popular support depends on economic prosperity, effective administration, and the kind of spectacles and entertainments that demonstrate imperial generosity and magnificence. Balancing these competing demands requires political skills that go far beyond the simple exercise of authority. It requires understanding that power is ultimately consensual, that even absolute rulers must maintain the consent of those they govern, and that this consent can be withdrawn if governance becomes sufficiently oppressive or incompetent. Caligula's failure wasn't just that he was cruel or arbitrary. It was that he lost the consent of every significant constituency in Roman society, leaving himself isolated and vulnerable when conspirators finally decided to act. His death serves as a permanent reminder to future emperors about the practical limitations of theoretical absolutism and the importance of maintaining relationships with groups capable of effective resistance. But it also demonstrates the costs of allowing political systems to reach the point where assassination becomes the only available remedy for governmental dysfunction. The violence that removes a dangerous leader also damages institutional legitimacy and creates precedents that can destabilize future administrations. This creates an ongoing dilemma for Roman political culture: how to maintain effective constraints on imperial behavior without undermining the authority that makes effective governance possible. Too much constraint, and the emperor becomes a figurehead, unable to address serious challenges. Too little constraint, and the emperor becomes a potential tyrant, capable of destroying the very system he's supposed to protect. Claudius's reign represents one attempt to find a workable balance between these competing imperatives, demonstrating that it's possible for emperors to wield substantial authority while remaining bound by law, tradition, and the practical necessities of maintaining public support. But his success depends on personal qualities, intelligence, moderation, respect for others that can't be guaranteed in future rulers, and that may not be sufficient when facing challenges more severe than those confronting his administration. The fundamental problem remains unsolved: how to create political systems that can harness the benefits of concentrated authority, while protecting against the dangers that such concentration inevitably creates. This question becomes increasingly urgent as the Roman Empire faces external pressures that require decisive leadership and internal tensions that demand careful management. The barbarian tribes beyond the frontiers are growing stronger and more organized. The provinces are developing regional identities that sometimes conflict with imperial unity. The economy is becoming more complex and more vulnerable to disruption. These challenges require governmental responses that are both effective and sustainable, policies that can address immediate problems without creating long-term instabilities. But they also require leadership that is both competent and trustworthy, qualities that Caligula's reign has demonstrated cannot be taken for granted. As you reflect on these larger questions while participating in the daily business of restored Roman government, you're struck by how much the experience of living through Caligula's reign has changed your understanding of politics, power, and human nature itself. You entered public service with idealistic assumptions about civic duty, institutional stability, and the relationship between merit and advancement. You believed that competent administration would naturally be rewarded, that rational policies would obviously be preferred to arbitrary ones, and that civilized people would instinctively choose order over chaos. Caligula's reign shattered these assumptions and forced you to confront darker truths about human psychology and social dynamics. You learned that people can adapt to almost any level of absurdity if adaptation is necessary for survival. You discovered that institutions are only as strong as the people who operate them, and that those people can be corrupted, intimidated, or eliminated when circumstances make resistance seem futile. Most disturbingly, you realize that the boundary between civilization and barbarism is much thinner than comfortable people want to believe, and that this boundary can be crossed with shocking speed when the wrong person gains access to unlimited power. These lessons have made you a more effective public servant in some ways, because they've taught you to plan for worst-case scenarios and to build safeguards against predictable forms of political pathology. But they've also made you more cynical about human nature and more pessimistic about the possibility of creating lasting solutions to fundamental political problems. You understand now that every generation must solve these problems anew, that institutional safeguards are only as reliable as the people who maintain them, and that the price of political freedom is indeed eternal vigilance against those who would trade that freedom for the promise of order, security, or prosperity under strong leadership. This understanding will prove valuable in the years ahead, as Rome faces new challenges that test the lessons learned from Caligula's reign and the reforms implemented during Claudius's restoration. The empire's survival will depend not just on military strength or economic prosperity, but on its ability to maintain the delicate balance between authority and freedom that makes civilized society possible. The story of Caligula's rise and fall becomes a cautionary tale that echoes through subsequent Roman history and beyond, reminding future generations that the greatest threat to any civilization may come not from external enemies but from internal corruption of the very systems designed to protect and preserve what makes life worth living. And as dawn breaks over a Rome that is slowly healing from its encounter with unlimited power wielded by unlimited madness, you prepare for another day of the patient, careful work of rebuilding trust, restoring institutions, and proving that human beings are capable of learning from their mistakes, even mistakes as catastrophic as giving absolute authority to someone who should never have been trusted with sharp objects, let alone supreme command over the fate of millions. But the work of rebuilding proves more complex than anyone had anticipated, because the damage inflicted by Caligula's reign extends far beyond the obvious problems of empty treasuries and demoralized institutions. The deeper injury is to Roman society's confidence in its own judgment, its ability to distinguish between competent leadership and dangerous delusion. How did an entire civilization, the most sophisticated, powerful, and administratively competent society the world had ever seen, allow itself to be governed for 4 years by someone whose mental state would have disqualified him from managing a tavern, let alone an empire? This question haunts every level of Roman society, as people try to understand not just what happened, but how they allowed it to happen. The senators who nodded gravely while discussing horse consuls, the administrators who efficiently implemented arbitrary policies, the soldiers who collected seashells as spoils of war, all must confront their own complicity in a system that transformed madness into policy and delusion into law. The explanations people offer for their behavior reveal as much about human psychology as they do about Roman politics. Many claim they were simply following orders, as if imperial commands automatically absolved them of moral responsibility for their consequences. Others insist they were working from within the system to limit damage, though few can point to specific instances where their influence actually moderated Caligula's behavior. Perhaps most commonly, people claim they knew all along that the emperor was dangerous but were powerless to act because resistance would have been futile and potentially counterproductive. This explanation has the advantage of preserving both moral dignity and practical wisdom, but it also raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between individual responsibility and collective action. Because the truth is that Caligula's power, however absolute it seemed, ultimately depended on the cooperation of thousands of people who could have chosen to resist his authority if they had been willing to accept the personal costs of resistance. Every senator who endorsed absurd policies, every administrator who implemented arbitrary orders, every soldier who participated in fraudulent campaigns was making an individual choice to prioritize personal survival over institutional integrity. These choices were understandable, even rational from a narrow self-interest perspective, but their cumulative effect was to enable a level of governmental dysfunction that threatened the survival of the entire civilization they were trying to preserve through their compliance. This creates a paradox that political philosophers will struggle with for centuries. Individual rationality can produce collective irrationality, and personal survival strategies can threaten the very systems that make survival possible. Claudius addresses this problem partly through policy changes that reduce the incentives for such destructive compliance. He implements procedures that require multiple approvals for major decisions, creates institutional safeguards that make it more difficult for future emperors to bypass traditional constraints, and establishes precedents that encourage advisory honesty rather than flattery. But he also understands that the deeper solution requires cultural change rather than just institutional reform. Romans need to redevelop the civic virtues that had characterized the Republic at its best: the willingness to sacrifice personal advantage for public good, the courage to speak truth to power even when it's dangerous, and the understanding that freedom requires constant vigilance against those who would trade it away for temporary security. This cultural restoration proves to be a generational project rather than an immediate transformation. The Romans who lived through Caligula's reign carry psychological scars that influence their behavior for the rest of their lives. They've learned to be suspicious of authority, cautious about expressing opinions, and skeptical about the possibility of effective resistance to governmental abuse. But their children and grandchildren grow up under Claudius's more rational administration, experiencing government as something that generally serves public interests rather than personal imperial whims. For them, the idea that emperors should be bound by law and tradition seems natural rather than revolutionary. This generational difference creates ongoing tensions within Roman society, as older citizens who remember Caligula's reign remain more deferential to authority, while younger Romans develop expectations about governmental accountability that would have seemed dangerously naive to their parents. These tensions become particularly visible during the later years of Claudius's reign, when the emperor's age and health problems create succession questions that force Romans to confront the fundamental instability of a system where governmental continuity depends on the mortality of individual rulers. The succession crisis that emerges as Claudius approaches his 70s reveals how little the underlying problems of the imperial system have been resolved. Despite the surface stability of his administration, the emperor has no obvious heir among his own children. His stepson Nero is young and untested, and the various potential claimants represent different visions of what imperial leadership should entail. More troublingly, the process of succession remains entirely arbitrary, dependent on palace intrigue, Praetorian Guard preferences, and the personal relationships that determine who has access to imperial decision-making during the crucial final months of Claudius's life. Your own position during this period illustrates the ongoing vulnerability of even senior officials to the whims of imperial politics. Despite your years of faithful service and demonstrated competence, your future depends entirely on whether the next emperor considers you valuable, threatening, or irrelevant to his plans. This creates the same kind of uncertainty and anxiety that had characterized Caligula's reign, though at a much lower level of intensity. You find yourself calculating which potential successors might favor your continued service, which might consider you a liability from the previous administration, and which might simply ignore you in favor of their own preferred advisors. The calculations are complex because each potential emperor represents different risks and opportunities. Nero, despite his youth, shows signs of intelligence and cultural sophistication that suggest he might value experienced administrators, but he's also been influenced by advisors whose own agendas might not include preserving continuity with Claudius's policies. The various military commanders who might attempt to claim power through force offer the stability that comes from proven leadership ability, but they also represent the dangerous precedent of military interference in civilian government that could destabilize the entire imperial system. Most concerningly, there are rumors of senators who believe Claudius's death might provide an opportunity to restore the Republic, eliminating the imperial system entirely in favor of a return to traditional Roman governmental structures. This last possibility is both appealing and terrifying. Appealing because it might restore the checks and balances that had prevented any individual from accumulating Caligula-level authority. Terrifying because the transition from imperial to republican government could easily trigger the kind of civil war that had destroyed the original republic and necessitated the imperial system in the first place. As Claudius's health deteriorates and these succession questions become more pressing, You find yourself involved in conversations that would have been treasonous just a few years earlier, but that now seem like necessary contingency planning for Rome's future. Fellow senators discuss the possibilities and dangers of different succession scenarios with the kind of clinical detachment that comes from experience with political instability. Military commanders evaluate the loyalty of their troops and the defensibility of their positions should competing claimants emerge. Provincial governors calculate whether their regions could survive independently if the central government collapses. These discussions reveal how fragile the stability of Claudius's reign actually is, and how much it depends on his personal ability to maintain the delicate balance between competing interests that keeps the imperial system functioning. The emperor's death, when it finally comes in 54 CE, occurs under circumstances that immediately raise questions about whether it was natural or assisted. Claudius had been in declining health for months, but his sudden deterioration after a dinner with his wife Agrippina and stepson Nero suggests the possibility of poison. The rumors are never definitively proved or disproved, but they create an atmosphere of suspicion that colors the early months of Nero's reign and reinforces the lesson that imperial succession is a dangerous process, where personal ambition often trumps legal or moral constraints. Nero's accession demonstrates both the strengths and weaknesses of the imperial system as it has evolved since Augustus's death. The transition is smooth, in the sense that there's no immediate civil war or institutional breakdown. The Praetorian Guard endorses the new emperor, the Senate provides formal recognition, and the provincial armies accept the succession without resistance. But the smoothness of the transition masks underlying problems that will become increasingly apparent as Nero's reign progresses. The new emperor is 17 years old, completely inexperienced in government, and surrounded by advisors whose influence depends on maintaining their access to imperial decision-making. More troublingly, Nero shows early signs of the same psychological traits that had made Caligula dangerous: grandiosity, impulsiveness, and a tendency to confuse personal desires with imperial policy. The theatrical interests that might be harmless in a private citizen become problematic when they're pursued by someone with unlimited resources and the expectation that his performances will be received with universal acclaim. Your own experience during the early years of Nero's reign provides a case study in how individual Romans adapt to changing imperial leadership and the uncertainty that such changes inevitably create. Initially, the new emperor seems promising. He's intelligent, culturally sophisticated, and apparently committed to maintaining the administrative competence that had characterized Claudius's government. His early policy decisions are reasonable, his treatment of the Senate is respectful, and his personal conduct appears to be within normal bounds for a young man of his social position. But gradually, subtle changes begin to appear that remind you uncomfortably of the early warning signs that had preceded Caligula's descent into madness. Nero's interest in theatrical performance becomes more consuming and more public. His spending on personal projects increases beyond what even imperial resources can comfortably support. His treatment of family members and close advisors begins to show signs of the paranoia and cruelty that seem to be occupational hazards of unlimited power. Most concerning is his apparent belief that imperial authority extends to areas of life that had traditionally been considered private matters. His decisions about marriage, entertainment, and personal relationships are increasingly treated as matters of state that require public endorsement and celebration. This gradual expansion of imperial authority into previously private spheres reflects a fundamental problem with the imperial system: the absence of clear boundaries between the emperor's personal life and his public responsibilities. When someone holds unlimited political power, it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish between their personal preferences and their official policies. Their entertainment choices become state expenses, their family relationships become diplomatic issues, and their psychological problems become governmental crises. Nero's reign illustrates how this boundary confusion can escalate over time as emperors become more comfortable with the idea that their authority should be unlimited in scope as well as intensity. The transformation is gradual enough that each individual step seems like a minor expansion of imperial prerogative rather than a fundamental change in the nature of government. But the cumulative effect is to recreate many of the same dynamics that had made Caligula's reign so destructive to Roman institutions and social fabric. The process accelerates after the death of Nero's advisor Seneca and the increasing influence of court favorites who benefit from encouraging the emperor's worst impulses rather than restraining them. Without experienced counselors willing and able to provide honest advice about the long-term consequences of imperial decisions, Nero becomes increasingly isolated in a bubble of flattery and enablement that reinforces his grandiose self-image, while insulating him from feedback about how his behavior affects the empire he's supposed to govern. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE becomes a turning point that reveals both Nero's capacity for effective leadership and his tendency toward megalomaniacal excess. His initial response to the disaster is competent and compassionate. He opens public buildings to shelter the homeless, organizes relief efforts, and begins planning for reconstruction that will make the city safer and more beautiful. But his longer-term response reveals the dangerous side of his personality. The reconstruction projects become exercises in imperial self-aggrandizement rather than practical urban planning. The new palace he builds for himself, the Domus Aurera, covers approximately 300 acres in the heart of Rome and includes gardens, lakes, and architectural features that serve no purpose beyond demonstrating the emperor's unlimited resources and unlimited ambition. Most troublingly, Nero uses the fire as justification for persecuting Christians, apparently believing that blaming an unpopular religious minority for the disaster will deflect attention from questions about his own role in the city's vulnerability and his use of reconstruction as an opportunity for personal aggrandizement. The persecution that follows is savage even by Roman standards, involving public executions designed as entertainment spectacles where Christians are burned alive, fed to wild animals, or crucified in imperial gardens, while Nero hosts dinner parties for the Roman elite. These events mark a return to the kind of arbitrary cruelty that had characterized Caligula's reign, though applied more selectively to groups that lack political influence rather than randomly throughout Roman society. But the psychological dynamics are similar, an emperor using unlimited power to satisfy personal psychological needs rather than serving the broader interests of the empire he's supposed to govern. Your own response to these developments reflects the complex moral calculations that Romans must make when living under increasingly arbitrary rule. The Christian persecutions are obviously unjust, but they're also popular with significant portions of the Roman population who view the new religion as a threat to traditional values and social stability. Speaking out against the persecutions would accomplish nothing except identifying you as a potential target for imperial displeasure, while remaining silent makes you complicit in injustices that violate your personal moral convictions. This dilemma, how to maintain personal integrity while surviving under arbitrary rule, becomes increasingly pressing as Nero's behavior becomes more extreme and more threatening to the stability of Roman government. The emperor's decision to perform publicly as an actor and musician, while personally harmless, violates Roman aristocratic values so profoundly that it undermines his legitimacy with the very elites whose support is necessary for effective governance. Traditional Roman culture viewed public performance as appropriate for slaves and freedmen, but degrading for citizens, particularly members of the senatorial class. For an emperor to appear on stage is not just personally embarrassing, but institutionally destructive, because it suggests that imperial authority itself is a form of performance rather than a serious responsibility. Nero's theatrical career becomes increasingly consuming as he tours Greece participating in musical competitions and dramatic festivals. The fact that he invariably wins these competitions despite his modest talent creates a farcical atmosphere that reminds Romans of Caligula's fraudulent military triumphs. But perhaps more damaging than the emperor's artistic pretensions is his increasing paranoia about potential rivals and conspirators. Like Caligula before him, Nero begins to see threats everywhere and to respond to perceived disloyalty with escalating violence. The conspiracy that finally forms against him in 65 CE is led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a senator whose motivation combines personal ambition with genuine concern about the empire's direction under increasingly erratic leadership. The Pisonian conspiracy involves dozens of participants from every level of Roman society: senators who want to restore republican government, military officers who believe Rome needs more competent leadership, and court officials who understand that Nero's behavior is becoming unsustainable. But the conspiracy is discovered before it can act, and Nero's response demonstrates how completely he has abandoned the restraint that had characterized the early years of his reign. The executions that follow are not just numerous but deliberately cruel, designed to terrorize potential opponents rather than simply eliminate them. Among the victims is Seneca, Nero's former tutor and advisor, who is forced to commit suicide despite having withdrawn from court politics years earlier. The death of someone who had once been closest to the emperor sends a clear message that no one is safe from imperial paranoia, and that loyalty provides no protection against arbitrary accusations. The purge that follows the conspiracy's discovery eliminates much of Rome's senatorial leadership and creates a power vacuum that makes effective governance increasingly difficult. Nero finds himself surrounded by courtiers who tell him what he wants to hear rather than what he needs to know, and isolated from the kind of honest counsel that might help him understand how his behavior is affecting the empire. This isolation accelerates his psychological deterioration and makes it increasingly difficult for him to distinguish between his personal fantasies and political reality. His decision to marry his freedman Sporus in a public ceremony that parodies traditional Roman wedding customs represents a complete break with social conventions that had governed imperial behavior since Augustus. The marriage is both personally scandalous and politically dangerous because it demonstrates that Nero no longer considers himself bound by any of the social or legal constraints that govern other Romans. If the emperor can ignore the most fundamental customs regarding marriage and family, what other boundaries might he be willing to cross? The answer becomes clear during the final years of his reign as Nero's behavior becomes increasingly divorced from any recognizable form of rational self-interest or even basic survival instinct. His decision to participate in the Olympic Games, where he falls from his chariot during a race but is declared the winner anyway, creates international embarrassment that damages Rome's reputation throughout the Mediterranean world. His plan to dig a canal across the Isthmus of Corinth, a project that would have been technically impossible with ancient engineering methods, wastes enormous resources on a scheme that exists only in his imagination. Most fatally, his neglect of military affairs and provincial administration creates opportunities for rebellion that more competent leadership might have prevented or contained. The revolt that begins in Gaul under Julius Vindex in 68 CE is initially a minor provincial uprising, but Nero's incompetent response allows it to spread and attract support from other regions where imperial administration has deteriorated under his neglect. More seriously, the revolt attracts support from Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, whose participation transforms a regional rebellion into a legitimate challenge to imperial authority. Galba represents everything that Nero is not: experienced, competent, respected by the military, and committed to traditional Roman values rather than theatrical innovation. His decision to support Vindex's rebellion gives the uprising the kind of credibility and leadership that turns it from a nuisance into an existential threat. Nero's response to this challenge reveals how completely his reign has destroyed his understanding of political reality. Instead of addressing the legitimate grievances that fuel the rebellion or implementing reforms that might restore confidence in imperial leadership, he focuses on completing preparations for a theatrical tour of Greece. Even when reports arrive that Galba has been proclaimed emperor by his troops and that the rebellion is spreading throughout the western provinces, Nero seems more concerned about cancelling his planned performances than about organizing military resistance to his rivals. This disconnection from reality extends to his relationship with the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty he takes for granted despite having given them numerous reasons to question his competence and stability. When the Guard finally withdraws their support and declares for Galba, Nero appears genuinely surprised, as if the possibility of military betrayal had never occurred to him despite the obvious precedent of Caligula's assassination. His death in 68 CE is appropriately theatrical, a suicide that he delays until the last possible moment while delivering dramatic speeches about the loss that his death will represent to the world of art. Even in his final moments, he seems more concerned about his reputation as a performer than about the empire he's leaving behind or the civil war his incompetence has made inevitable. The Year of the Four Emperors that follows Nero's death demonstrates how much damage arbitrary rule can inflict on the institutional foundations of imperial government. Within 18 months, Rome experiences the reigns of Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, each representing different constituencies and different visions of what imperial leadership should entail. The rapid succession of emperors creates instability that affects every aspect of Roman life. Provincial governors must constantly recalculate their loyalties as the identity of the legitimate emperor changes. Military units fight each other based on their commitment to competing claimants. Economic relationships are disrupted as currency and contracts become uncertain. Most seriously, The Civil War demonstrates how easily the imperial system can collapse when it loses the consent of key constituencies. The Praetorian Guard, the provincial armies, the Senate, and the urban populace all have the power to make or break emperors, but they also have conflicting interests that make stable governance extremely difficult when imperial authority is contested. Your own experience during this chaotic period illustrates how individual Romans navigate political instability and the moral choices that such instability creates. Each change of emperor requires you to evaluate whether your previous service will be valued or punished by the new regime. Each potential claimant represents different risks and opportunities for your continued participation in imperial administration. Most challengingly, you must decide whether to remain loyal to institutions that may not survive the current crisis, or to align yourself with personalities who might restore stability, but whose long-term intentions remain unclear. These decisions are complicated by the understanding that the choices you make during this crisis will influence not just your immediate survival, but your long-term reputation and the kind of government that emerges from the current chaos. The eventual victory of Vespasian represents both restoration and innovation, restoration of competent administration and military discipline, innovation in creating new mechanisms for ensuring imperial legitimacy and succession. Vespasian's background as a professional soldier rather than a member of the traditional aristocracy signals a fundamental change in the nature of imperial authority. He achieves power through military success rather than hereditary claim, and he maintains that power through demonstrated competence rather than dynastic prestige. This represents a potential solution to one of the imperial system's fundamental problems: how to ensure that capable leaders can emerge and thrive regardless of their family connections or social background. But it also creates new problems by making imperial succession dependent on military success and personal charisma rather than institutional processes that might provide more predictable transitions. The Flavian dynasty that Vespasian establishes demonstrates both the strengths and weaknesses of this new model of imperial legitimacy. His reign and that of his son Titus are marked by competent administration, successful military campaigns, and the kind of building projects that enhance Rome's prestige while serving practical purposes. But the dynasty's end with Domitian's assassination in 96 CE reveals that the underlying problems of the imperial system remain unsolved. Domitian's reign recapitulates many of the patterns that had made Caligula and Nero dangerous: increasing paranoia, arbitrary cruelty, disconnection from political reality, and the gradual transformation of imperial authority from public service into personal gratification. The cycle repeats because the fundamental structure of the imperial system remains unchanged: unlimited power concentrated in individual hands, with no effective institutional constraints on how that power is exercised. Each emperor must reinvent the limitations on his own authority, and each emperor faces the temptation to use his power for personal rather than public purposes. Some resist this temptation more successfully than others, but none can eliminate it entirely because the system itself creates incentives for abuse. As you reflect on your lifetime of service under 6 different emperors, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Vespasian, and now Domitian, you understand that you've witnessed a fundamental experiment in human governance and its limitations. The imperial system has provided Rome with periods of remarkable prosperity, territorial expansion, and cultural achievement that would have been impossible under the chaotic conditions of the late Republic. But it has also created recurring crises of legitimacy, succession, and institutional decay that threaten the very achievements it has made possible. The question that will face future generations of Romans is whether these problems can be solved through institutional reform, or whether they're inherent in any system that concentrates ultimate authority in individual hands. Your own experience suggests that the answer may depend less on constitutional engineering than on cultural values. The willingness of citizens to prioritize long-term institutional health over short-term personal advantage, and the ability of leaders to understand that their authority exists to serve purposes larger than their own psychological needs. These are lessons that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of Roman history, because they address fundamental questions about human nature, political authority, and the conditions necessary for civilized society to survive and flourish. As evening approaches and you prepare for another night in a Rome that continues to struggle with these eternal challenges, you're reminded that the story of Caligula's rise and fall isn't just ancient history. It's a window into the timeless human drama of power, corruption, and the ongoing effort to create systems of government that serve human flourishing rather than human ambition.